Welcome back to the Fantasy Trading Room, hosted by Faceoff Sports Network. And today we're going to be diving into some Week 8 fantasy football waiver wire pickups. Now, these pickups can help you win your league as we get down to the final stretch. And to start things off, we have Josh Downs, who is rostered in 34.5% of leagues and just had a massive Week 7 with 23.5 fantasy points. Now, coming into this year, I wasn't extremely high on Downs in redraft because of a situation. He was stepping into what looked like to be the wide receiver 3 of this offense. People forget Alec Pierce was a second-round pick just a few years ago, but he's more of a field stretcher and Downs is more of a slot guy. Anthony Richardson looked pretty good when he did play, but of course, there were a lot of questions coming out of Florida. He primarily added value as a rushing quarterback, didn't really throw the ball at a high clip, and in college, when he did throw it, he was wildly inefficient, so there were a ton of questions in that regard. But now Minshew's in. He's going to throw the ball a lot more considering he is very immobile. But Michael Pittman, you see, has 5 targets and Downs has 6. That's because Pittman is that alpha wide receiver 1 where he has those big plays. But Downs can also be very relevant because he leads the team in receptions, playing in those underneath type routes, getting 5 receptions, 125 yards, and the touchdown on that big 59-yard play. But I really like Downs. I think he can definitely be a viable flex option with upside for the rest of the season. So I would be claiming him as the top wide receiver on the waiver wire. Then heading over to our wide receiver 2 on the week, we have Odell Beckham Jr., who is rushing in 44.5% of leagues. And he didn't have a phenomenal week 7, but he had 9.9 points. But more importantly, he led the team in targets over Zay Flowers. Now, the wide receiver position is pretty shallow, but we know the potential Odell Beckham has. We know what he can do, and yes, he's old. I'm not sure if he's washed quite yet. We've seen him deal with a lot of injuries, but just like on the Rams, he can come back really at any time and just dominate for a stretch of games. I think we know what the upside holds. Lamar Jackson looked phenomenal last game, and 5 receptions, 50 yards is not bad at all. Of course, you got Mark Andrews, but he hasn't been as consistent as we'd like this year, despite having a massive game this week. Then Zay Flowers is there, but that's really about it. Rashad Bateman hasn't emerged. We don't really have a clear wide receiver 2 in this offense. So even though the Ravens offense isn't an offense that I'm necessarily trying to get every single player in, considering they don't pass the ball at an extremely high clip on most weeks because they have Lamar Jackson who runs the ball. And they're also just a running team by nature. I really like Odell Beckham as a type of stash. I think the upside is there to where if he comes back, fully healthy and the Ravens are playing amazing like Lamar was doing last week, he could definitely have an insane stretch near the end of the year. It could be a easy fantasy league winner, just like these guys like Jared McKinnon at the end of last year. I could see him as a older veteran, get streaky, and could win a ton of fantasy football championships. But let's head over to the running back position. We have the Rams running back, Darrell Henderson, who's rostered in 12.1% of leagues. Now, Royce Freeman actually had a higher yards per carry mark last game, but Darrell Henderson had the touches. He had 18 carries compared to Freeman at 12. And it really just looks like Henderson's going to be the guy in a 2-man committee going forward. Zach Evans did not play. Darrell Henderson has been with the team for quite some time. He's been used in the past, and I think Sean McVay likes him to some extent. Darrell Henderson obviously isn't the most talented player in the world, so you can't really justify him being your bell cow when you have a guy like Kyron Williams healthy and what he's done so far. But Royce Freeman isn't a phenomenal talent. I'm not going out there being like, oh, he had 5.5 yards per carry. We know he's been so good in the past. Like, he's going to take over Darrell Henderson because Henderson himself is not that great to begin with. I think they're both mediocre backs, but Henderson's getting to work right now. And Henderson has just generally been favored more by that Rams coaching system and Sean McVay. So he's the running back I would be grabbing. But again, I don't mind picking up Royce Freeman as well if Henderson is somehow already claimed, or you're just not able to get him and you need a running back stash to put on your bench and maybe plug and play with these bye weeks and injuries. But for our second running back, we definitely have a stash in Tyjae Spears, only rostered in 33.8% of leagues, and he didn't have the biggest week 6 as the Titans were on bye this past week. but he's getting work in this offense. And Derrick Henry could be a potential trading block at the deadline. The Titans aren't looking good at all, and I could definitely see them moving on from their pieces. Derrick Henry is obviously their best player by far. A contender could go out there and say, Derrick Henry is going to take me over the top. He hasn't been phenomenal this year, but we all know what Derrick Henry is. I don't really think too many teams would turn down Henry at a reasonable price as long as they're contending. And if that happens, Spears could be an absolute league winner. Now, there's also an injury risk of Henry. He is getting up there. He's very old, and Spears has just looked phenomenal. On top of that, Spears has gotten a lot more playing time than initially expected. He's actually seen 50% of the snaps quite a bit this year, as when the Titans are trailing, they put in Spears. Spears is a player that I really liked coming out of college. He has a ton of upside, and he's a smaller back, but he does a lot of things well. He's very explosive in between the tackles. He's a good pass catcher. And Spears is really a guy that if he gets the opportunity to shine on a week-to-week basis, I could definitely see him being a league winner. But until now, he's going to have spot start upside, assuming something goes wrong. But again, he's not a guy that you can start almost any single week without Derrick Henry being moved off of the Titans. With that said, let's go to the tight end of the week. We have Dalton Kincaid, who was drafted a ton early on, but after disappointing, he's only rostered in 31.3% of leagues now. In week 7, he had 15.5 fantasy points. Now, we have been very spoiled with Sam Laporta, but rookie tight ends don't normally produce in their first year anyway. So I wasn't really too concerned about Kincaid. I actually did draft a lot of Sam Laporta, so I just felt like the price was right with how late he was being drafted and how early Kincaid was being drafted. I was out on him, but it looks like Nick Kincaid is finally going to be able to take over that tight end 1 spot for the Bills, which is massive. You know, Dawson Knox was very fantasy relevant last year with all that touchdown upside, but I believe Kincaid was only 3 snaps behind him this week. And as far as targets go, Knox had 3 for 1 catch. Kincaid had 8 and caught all 8 passes. So that's something you love to see. A big breakout. And if you're a Kincaid fan, I would definitely be going out there and grabbing him. Now we've actually seen what his big game could look like without any touchdowns. He was a very active part of this offense. Now, obviously, you have Stephon Diggs, but Gabe Davis isn't a guy that you can rely on a week-to-week basis. So Kincaid could very well be the number 2 target in this electric Bills offense if he keeps this pace and Gabe Davis just continues to be the big play field stretcher that he is. I really like Kincaid, and in such a bad tight end landscape like it is every year, I think he's definitely worth adding to your roster if you have a tight end on bye that's not worth keeping, outside of those top 5 guys. Like we got Kittle, Hawkinson, Kelsey, Goddard, and then Laporta, any of those guys like that. But if you're at the bottom of the barrel, I think it's honestly worth picking up Kincaid, dropping who you already have. Or if you just have the space to throw a stash in, I would be going with Kincaid. And lastly, we have our quarterback, which is Kyler Murray. Again, another stash, but it looks like he could play this year. Now, it doesn't really make too much sense for me that the Cardinals would bring him back, but this is the NFL, and if players are healthy, they'll oftentimes play. We forget that teams can't technically tank. So if Kyler's out here saying, I'm healthy, I'm ready to play, there's a pretty good chance that he'll actually be playing. And if he does, he provides you quarterback 1 upside that no other guy on the waiver wire can touch. We've seen him throughout his career. His rookie year, 17.8 fantasy points, hit his peak with 23.7, and then has hovered around 18 to 20 fantasy points for almost every year. He's looked phenomenal. He has that rushing upside, and even though the Cardinals are a very bad offense, a part of that is mainly because Kyler Murray hasn't been in it, but he has Marquise Brown. Hopefully James Conner should be back. Michael Wilson's a very solid asset as well. They got guys like Zach Ertz. So it's not the worst offense in the world for Kyler. By no means is it great, but he is rushing upside. We've seen what he can do in the past, and we're just shooting for upside at the quarterback position, especially if you don't have – this really only pertains if you don't already have an elite quarterback. But if you're trying to match these teams with elite quarterbacks and you're at the bottom of the barrel, once again, QB, I think adding Kyler Murray is definitely a smart move to the bottom of your bench. I would really love that. And again, we have a user suggested part of the video. We have the must cuts for this week. Now, you're going to be wondering who you should be cutting to clear space for these guys. And I would say in a lot of cases, it's low-end players at the position that are on bye. Obviously, players that are injured for an extended period of time and aren't normally a part of your fantasy lineup. But right now, here's what ESPN says is the most dropped players. Notably looking at this, I'm not really sure about Amari DiMercato. He had a solid week. I wouldn't say he's a must-cut. I don't like dropping Ferguson. Henry, I don't really like too much either, but Perrine, I think, is very fine at this point. He hasn't had a role. Javante's back. We have Jaleel. Get Perrine off the roster. And on top of that, I don't like having any Broncos anyway, as they're just bad. Tutu, I'd say, isn't a must-cut, but he's definitely been underwhelming with the return of Cooper Kupp. If you can get an option like Downs, I would be cutting Tutu for him. And even OBJ, I would considering it based on your team structure. But again, Cam Akers hasn't looked great. Tank Dell is out. So 2 viable cuts depending on your team makeup. Then we got Dalvin Cook, who I would honestly drop him for Darrell Henderson. He hasn't been the same since the Vikings. And Breece Hall looks at 100%. So that makes a ton of sense. Josh Kelly, he had an all right game this week. But again, I'm not trusting him going forward. I would be dropping him as always. And Khalil Herbert, I think if you need points now, it really makes sense to drop him for Darrell Henderson because he's on the IR right now. Donta Foreman looked great. Roshan's there. It's a crowded backfield anyway. Kincaid was, you can see this was from last week as he was trending downhill. I would obviously not be dropping Kincaid. And Breida and Gainwell are both drops. Gainwell had a touchdown, but again, I don't really see the rest of the season upside with how good Swift has looked. And Breida, there's no chance you should ever be starting him. We got Saquon here, and even if Saquon's out, Breida is just not good at football, so no reason to ever be starting him. I would be totally fine taking Darrell Henderson and even Tyjae Spears over him 100% as a stash. Much rather have Spears than a guy like Gainwell or Matt Breida. But that's going to wrap things up. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you're looking for more fantasy football content, we break down the top 24 wide receivers and running backs every single Friday, and of course, we do the waiver wire videos every single Tuesday as well, helping you guys win your league. But I'm Steve Bradshaw from the Fantasy Trading Room and Faceoff Sports Network. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next video.